A routine traffic stop, a smug white cop, a black woman who refused to be broken. He framed her, humiliated her, and thought he had won. But when she pulled out her ID, the entire precinct fell silent. What happened next left everyone in shock and ended his career in seconds. The sun hung low over the city, casting long shadows on the worn asphalt as the evening rush began. At an intersection near downtown, traffic lights flickered red, halting the slow-moving cars. Inside, a modest, unassuming sedan, sat Tara Williams, her fingers tapping lightly against the steering wheel as she waited for the light to change. Dressed in a simple gray hoodie and faded jeans, she looked like any other commuter navigating the city streets after a long day. No expensive jewelry, no high-profile car, nothing about her stood out. And that was exactly the point. Tara had spent years perfecting the art of being invisible. As a high-ranking CIA field operative, she had worked undercover in some of the most dangerous parts of the world. She had dismantled trafficking rings, taken down international arms dealers, and walked out of war zones unscathed. But tonight, she wasn't in a foreign country. She was in her own city, in her own country, investigating something far more insidious: corruption within the police department. For months, she had been quietly gathering intel on Officer Daniel Miller, a white cop notorious for targeting black drivers, fabricating charges, and shaking down innocent people for bribes. The department had received complaints, but none had stuck. Witnesses recanted, evidence disappeared, and Miller continued his reign unchecked. But Tara wasn't just any witness. She wasn't someone he could intimidate into silence. As the light turned green, she eased her car forward, only to see flashing blue and red lights appear in her rearview mirror. A heavy sigh left her lips. Right on schedule. She pulled over, keeping her hands on the wheel as she watched Miller step out of his patrol car, moving with the lazy confidence of a man who had done this 1,000 times before. He approached her window, his face wearing a smug grin even before he spoke. "License and registration," he said, his tone dripping with casual arrogance. Tara didn't argue. She had learned long ago that men like him thrived on resistance. It fed their sense of power. Silently, she reached into her glove compartment, retrieving her documents before handing them over. Miller barely glanced at them before tilting his head. "You know why I pulled you over?" Tara met his gaze in the side mirror, her face unreadable. "No." Miller smirked. "Your taillight is out." It wasn't. Tara knew every inch of her car, and she had checked her lights that morning. But she didn't correct him. She just watched as he took a slow step back, surveying her car like a predator circling its prey. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Tara exhaled quietly. "Here we go." She moved calmly, her heart rate steady. She had been trained to face warlords, assassins, and terrorists. This was nothing. Yet as she stepped onto the pavement, she could feel the shift in the air. Other officers had now arrived, standing at a distance, watching with disinterest. Miller circled her car once, then twice, before stopping near the driver's side door. His hand slipped into his vest pocket, and for a brief moment, Tara saw it. The small plastic bag filled with white powder. A well-rehearsed routine. A show he had performed on countless others. And now, he thought she was just another easy target. He turned back to her, his grin widening. "Well, well," he drawled. "Looks like we've got a little problem here." Tara watched as Officer Miller held up the small plastic bag between his fingers, shaking his head in mock disappointment. The white powder inside caught the glow of the streetlights, an undeniable accusation in the making. "Well, well," he said, voice thick with amusement. Looks like we've got a little problem here. Tara remained still, her expression unreadable. She had seen this playbook before. The smug authority, the casual planting of evidence, the expectation that fear would paralyze the victim into submission. Miller stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. You know how this works. We can do this the easy way, or... He let the words hang in the air, his smirk widening. Behind him, 2 other officers stood near their patrol cars, watching with thinly veiled indifference. They weren't going to intervene. Whether out of apathy or complicity, it didn't matter. Tara let out a slow breath, her gaze unwavering. You're making a mistake. Miller chuckled. Oh, I don't think so. His fingers tightened around her wrist as he spun her around, forcing her hands behind her back. The cold bite of metal snapped around her wrists as he cuffed her with an unnecessary amount of force. You're under arrest for possession of a controlled substance, he announced, loud enough for bystanders across the street to hear. A few heads turned, some pausing to watch, but no one stepped forward. They had likely seen this scene play out before. Tara didn't resist. She had no intention of making this easy for him, but she also wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of a struggle. Miller leaned in slightly, his breath warm against her ear. Bet you thought you were smarter than this, huh? Tara smiled, just a little. I still do. Something in her tone made Miller hesitate, just for a fraction of a second. But then he shoved her toward the back of the squad car. As she sank into the seat, she caught sight of one of the younger officers lingering by the curb. A black man, maybe in his late 20s, shifting uncomfortably. His hands twitched at his sides, as if debating whether to say something. But when Miller turned and shot him a look, he dropped his gaze. Tara memorized his face. That one still had a conscience. Miller climbed into the driver's seat, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel as he let out a satisfied sigh. Gotta say, lady, you're taking this pretty well. Most people in your position would be crying by now. Tara turned her head slightly, meeting his eyes through the rearview mirror. Most people don't know what I know. Miller laughed. Yeah? And what's that? She didn't answer. She just watched the city blur past as he pulled away from the curb, driving her straight toward his own downfall. The squad car moved through the city streets, the flashing lights casting streaks of red and blue across the buildings. Tara sat motionless in the back seat, her hands cuffed behind her, but her mind was already 5 steps ahead. Every turn Miller took, every word he muttered under his breath, every nervous glance he shot at the rearview mirror, it all painted a clear picture. He was arrogant, sure of himself, but he wasn't careful, and men like him always made mistakes. The radio crackled with static before a dispatcher's voice came through. Officer Miller, status update on the 1015? Miller reached for the radio, pressing the button with a smirk. Yeah, dispatch. We've got one in custody. Possible narcotics possession. Transporting to precinct now. Tara leaned back against the seat, rolling her shoulders slightly to test the tightness of the cuffs. Miller had done them too tight on purpose, but discomfort was the least of her concerns. You should call this in properly, she said, her voice calm. Miller scoffed. And why's that? Tara met his gaze in the mirror, tilting her head slightly. Because in about 10 minutes, you're going to need every excuse you can find. Miller chuckled, shaking his head. Lady, I don't know what fantasy you're living in, but let me make something real clear for you. You're just another nobody, and nobodies don't get to talk like that. She watched him, expression unreadable. We'll see. The car pulled into the precinct's back lot, where another officer stood waiting by the side entrance. Miller yanked the door open and grabbed her arm, pulling her out roughly. He wasn't being careful anymore. He wanted a show. Inside, the station buzzed with low conversations, phones ringing, the steady clatter of keyboards. Officers moved through the space, some barely glancing up, as Miller led her toward processing. Others, those who had seen him do this routine before, exchanged knowing looks, smirks passing between them, like a silent joke. A sergeant stood behind the booking desk, glancing at Miller as they approached. "What's this?" "Caught her with a little something in her car," Miller said, tossing the plastic bag onto the desk. "We'll add possession to the charge sheet." The sergeant picked up the bag, eyeing it for a moment before nodding. "All right. Print her, process her, and wait." The voice wasn't loud, but it carried. Every head in the room turned. It was the young black officer from earlier, the one who had hesitated at the scene. He stepped forward now, shifting his weight between his feet. Miller sighed, already annoyed. "Something you want to say, rookie?" The young officer swallowed hard, eyes flicking toward Tara, before settling back on Miller. I saw you search her car." Miller's jaw tightened. "And?" The rookie hesitated. "And I didn't see her put anything there." A silence settled over the room. It was thin, fragile, like glass about to shatter. Miller let out a dry laugh. "Are you questioning my report?" The rookie hesitated for half a second too long. That was enough. Miller's expression darkened. He stepped closer, voice dropping just enough that only the two of them could hear. "You sure you want to do this, kid?" The rookie's throat bobbed as he swallowed. He was young, ambitious, and, most dangerously, still believed in the idea that the badge meant something. Tara watched him carefully. He wasn't ready to fight this battle. Not yet. So she spoke before he could. "He's right," she said, her voice cutting clean through the tension. "I never put anything in that car." Miller turned back to her, the annoyance in his face quickly masking something sharper, concern. "You don't get to talk," he snapped. Tara's lips curved into a slow smile. "You sure about that?" And then, with deliberate ease, she shifted her stance, rolling back her shoulders. The movement pulled her sleeve slightly, revealing the glint of something small and metallic beneath the fabric. Miller frowned. "What the hell is—" Her hands moved fast, too fast. In one smooth motion, she turned just enough to pull the hidden badge free from beneath her sleeve, flipping it open and holding it up. A CIA identification card. The room froze. The sergeant at the desk blinked, then looked at Miller. "Tell me you didn't just—" Miller took a step back. No, that's—" He looked around, as if expecting someone to step in, to deny what they were all seeing. But no one spoke. Tara's smile widened, just slightly. "What's wrong, officer? You don't look so sure anymore." Miller's fingers twitched at his sides, his breathing uneven. This was impossible. She wasn't supposed to be anyone. She was supposed to be another easy arrest. Tara took a slow step forward, forcing him back another inch. Her voice was steady, measured, but laced with something lethal. "Here's what's going to happen next," she said. "You're going to uncuff me. You're going to call your captain. And then, you're going to pray that I'm in a forgiving mood." Miller's jaw clenched, his mind scrambling for an escape. But there wasn't one. Not this time. The sergeant exhaled heavily and turned to one of the officers nearby. "Get the captain. Now." Miller's face was pale. Tara watched the realization sink in. For the first time, he wasn't the one in control, and he had never looked more terrified. The precinct was silent. Not the kind of silence that came with routine, but the heavy, suffocating stillness that signaled something had just gone terribly wrong. Officer Miller stood frozen, his face drained of color, as the weight of Tara's badge settled over him like a noose tightening around his throat. Every officer in the room was staring, their expressions shifting from amusement to disbelief. Some took slow steps backward, as if distancing themselves from the inevitable fallout. Tara held his gaze, her stance relaxed, controlled, completely opposite to the chaos brewing inside him. "Go ahead," she said, voice smooth, almost amused. "Take the cuffs off." Miller's fingers twitched, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. He didn't move. The sergeant at the desk exhaled sharply. "Miller," he said, voice low, warning. But Miller still didn't react. He was trapped in his own disbelief, his brain scrambling for a way out. He had planted evidence on countless people before. None of them had ever fought back. And definitely, none of them had ever been CIA. Tara took a small step forward. "What's wrong?" she asked, tilting her head. "You seemed so confident earlier." The humiliation in his eyes was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the growing panic beneath it. He had been in control minutes ago, had smirked as he put her in handcuffs, had enjoyed watching her sit in the back of his squad car, like she was just another statistic. And now he was the one being scrutinized, the one being judged, the one whose career was seconds away from turning into a nightmare. Finally, his hands moved. With stiff, jerking motions, he yanked the key from his belt and reached for her wrists. The cuffs clicked open, the cold steel falling away. Tara rolled her shoulders, rubbing her wrists lightly, but her eyes never left his. A slow smile touched her lips. "That wasn't so hard, was it?" Miller stepped back quickly, like he had touched something burning. A door slammed open from the hallway, and a tall man in a captain's uniform strode in, his gaze immediately locking onto Tara. His jaw tightened. "Agent Williams," he said, voice carefully measured. "What the hell is going on here?" Tara turned slightly, slipping her badge back into her pocket. "That's a great question, Captain." She gestured toward Miller with a casual flick of her wrist. "Seems like one of your officers made an unfortunate error in judgment." The captain's eyes flicked between them, sharp and assessing. He had clearly heard enough to know that this wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. An error? The word was quiet, but the rage behind it was unmistakable. Miller opened his mouth, desperate to salvage what little ground he had left. "Captain, Tara cut him off. "He stopped me without cause, searched my vehicle, planted evidence, arrested me under false charges." Her smile didn't reach her eyes. "Oh, and he tried to intimidate me into staying silent." A muscle twitched in the captain's jaw. His gaze snapped to Miller. "Is this true?" Miller hesitated. Too long. The captain turned to the sergeant. "Who else was here?" The rookie officer shifted uncomfortably before stepping forward. His voice wasn't strong, but it was steady. I saw it, sir." The air in the room thickened. Tara didn't look at Miller. She didn't need to. She already knew. He was done. Miller stood motionless, his face pale, his fingers twitching at his sides as if he could somehow undo the last 30 minutes of his life. The room had turned against him. Officers who once shared his smug confidence now looked away, avoiding his gaze like he was a sinking ship they wanted no part of. The captain's voice was like a hammer striking cold steel. "Hand over your badge and gun." Miller's breath hitched. "Sir, That wasn't a request." Silence. A long, suffocating pause before Miller reached for his belt with stiff fingers, unhooking his gun and placing it on the desk. His badge followed, the metal clinking against the wood, a sound final and absolute. Tara watched him, unreadable. There was no satisfaction in her expression, no triumph. Just a quiet inevitability, as if this moment had been written long before he ever pulled her over. The rookie officer shifted beside her, his gaze flickering between them. He looked shaken but resolute, as if he had just realized the weight of the uniform he wore. Miller turned to Tara, something dark and bitter in his eyes. He opened his mouth, maybe to defend himself, maybe to lash out. But she spoke first. "You set yourself up," she said simply. His jaw clenched, but he said nothing. The captain motioned to another officer. "Escort him out." Miller was led away, his footsteps heavy, each step dragging him further from the authority he had once wielded so carelessly. No one stopped him. No one said a word. As the door swung shut behind him, the precinct seemed to breathe again. Tara exhaled slowly, rolling her shoulders before turning toward the exit. She had no interest in watching what came next. Internal investigations, disciplinary hearings, the slow dismantling of everything Miller had built on lies. That wasn't her fight. She had already won, and she didn't even have to raise her voice. As Tara stepped outside, the cool night air met her skin, a stark contrast to the heated tension she had just left behind. The city hummed around her, cars passing, distant sirens wailing, life moving on as if nothing had happened. But inside that precinct, a lesson had been carved into the walls, one that wouldn't be forgotten anytime soon. She paused at the steps, glancing up at the dark sky before pulling her phone from her pocket. With a few quick taps, she sent a message, a simple line. "It's done." Somewhere, someone would receive it. Files would be opened, reports would be written, and Miller's name would be added to a long list of men who thought their power made them untouchable. Tara took one last breath, then walked toward her car, slipping back into the anonymity she had mastered so well. No victory speech, no need for applause. The real win was in knowing that tonight, at least one person had learned that power wasn't about a badge, a uniform, or a gun. It was about knowing when to stand, when to speak, and when to let the truth do the work for you. Now the question is, if you were in Tara's shoes, would you have handled it differently? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us who really holds the power.